You may imagine a medieval festival as a rowdy event filled with noise, colours, and the scent of meat roasting over wood fires. But the truth is that most village gatherings were much quieter than you might think. They were less like grand celebrations and more like long, slow social obligations that tied people to the rhythms of the land. In a small village near the edge of the river Elbe, this was certainly the case. For centuries, the residents held a humble harvest festival centered around geese, of all creatures. Not because geese were glamorous, and not because they were especially symbolic, but simply because the village raised more geese than anything else. It was a practical choice, and practicality defined most medieval customs far more than symbolism ever did. You would find the village by following a dirt road that twisted between rye fields and patches of marsh grass. The settlement was small enough that the sound of one person chopping wood on the outskirts could be heard from nearly every home. Most roofs were thatched, though a handful had wooden shingles that darkened after every rainfall. At the far end of the central path sat the goose pens. These were little more than fenced mud squares where the birds waddled, honked, and occasionally flapped in indignation. The villagers tolerated them the way one tolerates badly behaved but necessary animals. The harvest festival had taken place in this very spot for generations. It was not a festival in the lively, bustling sense, but more of a communal duty. After the grain was stored, after the root vegetables were buried in earthen mounds for winter safekeeping, the villagers gathered to share food, offer thanks, and prepare a portion of the flock for the cold months ahead. The geese were not symbols of prosperity. They were simply food that needed to be processed before frost set in. Still, people attached customs to them. They always do. The festival included a procession in which a single goose was selected to walk at the front, guided by a short wooden stick. The creature was called the honor goose, and though the title meant nothing to the bird, it meant everything to the villagers. It was believed that whichever household provided the honor goose would enjoy a year with fewer illnesses and more stable harvests. No one knew where this belief began. Such traditions grow slowly, like moss on a stone, until no one remembers when the first patch appeared. Into this quiet world came a goose farmer named Ulrich, a man whose presence would eventually end the festival forever. At the time, he was not known for anything remarkable. He was simply the son of another goose farmer, expected to carry on the same work. He lived in a timber-framed house beside the largest of the pens, where the air always smelled faintly of feathers and wet earth. His neighbors described him as broad-shouldered, patient, and perhaps a little too prideful of his flock. Pride was not uncommon among medieval farmers, who viewed their animals the way a craftsman viewed his tools. But Ulrich's pride had an edge to it that unsettled some of the older villagers. Ulrich managed the largest flock in the village, and for several seasons in a row, one of his geese had been chosen as the honor goose. He considered this a sign not of luck, but of his own skill. You could hear it in the way he spoke to travelers passing through. He would stand near the pen with a stable hand or two, describing the care he took, the grain mixtures he perfected, and the ways he trained the birds to respond to his voice. It is strange to imagine training a goose, but he swore it was possible, and perhaps it was. Medieval people relied on keen observation. They noticed the smallest shifts in weather, soil texture, and animal behavior, because their survival depended on it. Still, pride can cloud even sharp observation. And in Ulrich's case, that pride would collide with long-standing tradition in a way no one could have predicted. On the morning of the harvest festival, villagers gathered in the central square. You would have seen woven baskets filled with early winter apples, clay jugs of weak ale, and loaves of barley bread, baked in communal ovens. Children carried small wooden noisemakers. Older women sat on low stools, mending simple cloths, while exchanging slow, meandering conversations. Medieval life moved at a pace far more deliberate than modern life. People waited as a matter of habit. Waiting was woven into everything they did. The honor goose was chosen near midday. Traditionally, the selection involved a simple process. The elders examined the candidates and selected one that appeared healthy, calm, and mature. None of it was complicated. Yet this year, Ulrich insisted that his chosen bird, a large white goose he called Older, be selected by default. He argued that his flock had produced the last several honor geese, and that Older's size made him the obvious choice. The elders hesitated. Tradition was not supposed to bend to convenience, but Ulrich was persuasive, perhaps overly so. He spoke at length, describing Older's impressive feathers, steady gait, and breeding lineage. By the end, the elders reluctantly agreed. The procession began as usual. Men and women formed two lines along the central path, tapping their wooden sticks lightly on the ground. Children scattered bits of grain to encourage the goose forward. You could imagine the scene, a slow-moving parade of villagers following a slightly irritated bird as it waddled through mud and leaves. The air carried the crisp scent of late autumn, and wood smoke curled from the chimneys. But Alder was not calm. Something about the crowd unsettled him. Perhaps the noise, or the unfamiliar attention, or simply the pressure of the moment. Geese do not understand honor, but they do understand fear. Halfway through the procession, Alder lunged at one of the children, scattering grain. The child was startled but unhurt. The crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. The elders exchanged glances. Aldrich stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control of the bird, but Alder hissed and flapped his wings, knocking Aldrich backward into a patch of mud. This caused laughter among some of the younger villagers, though the elders frowned. Pride was being humbled publicly, and in medieval villages, such moments carried weight far beyond the embarrassment. Ulrich, red-faced and muddy, attempted again to guide the goose, but Alder had decided he wanted no part of the ceremony. In a sudden burst of frantic energy, the bird broke free of his tether and charged directly into the line of villagers. Women toppled from stools, grain spilled across the mud, children shrieked. The procession dissolved into scattered movement as people scrambled to avoid the flapping wings and snapping beak of an enraged bird. It would have been a brief accident, easily forgiven, if not for what followed. For reasons no one fully understood, Alder sprinted toward the long table where the elders sat. In a moment that would be retold for years wherever the villagers travelled, the goose leapt onto the table, knocking over jugs, scattering bread loaves, and splattering one of the elders with a full cup of watered ale. The elder, a man known for his calm demeanour, slipped in the mess and fell backward off the bench, injuring his arm. Silence fell. The villagers stared. Ulrich stood frozen. Alder continued honking triumphantly, unaware of the chaos he had created. It was clear something had gone wrong that would not be forgotten. In tight-knit medieval communities, an incident involving injury and public disruption carried long-lasting consequences. Festivals were more than gatherings. They were threads binding the village together. A broken thread created anxiety about future events, about luck, about the relationship between people and the rituals that gave structure to their lives. The elders met that evening in a timber hall lit by a few dim tallow candles. They discussed the incident quietly, in the slow, thoughtful pace that defined their decisions. They weighed the meaning of the disrupted procession. They debated Ulrich's pride, Alder's behaviour, and the risks of repeating such a ceremony the following year. You can picture it, worn hands resting on wooden tables, voices low, the smell of extinguished rushlights drifting through the air. At dawn the next day, they delivered their conclusion. The goose procession, which had survived countless seasons, was banned, not suspended, not adjusted, entirely banned. There would be no more honor geese, no more processions, no more linking the survival of households to the behavior of a bird. The villagers accepted the decision with quiet resignation. Traditions ended slowly, but they could also end suddenly, with one chaotic afternoon. And Ulrich, who had once spoken so proudly of his flock, found himself avoiding the town square for many days afterward. When you look back on a medieval community from a modern perspective, you might imagine that customs were unchanging, held firmly in place by the weight of generations. Yet the reality was more fragile. Traditions endured only because the people who practiced them believed they served a purpose, and when that purpose seemed shaken, old rituals could crumble quickly. This was the case in the small riverside village, where the goose festival had lasted through countless autumns. What had once been a humble but stable event now stood on uncertain ground, and the elders faced pressure to decide whether the accident with the honor goose represented an isolated misfortune, or a sign that something deeper had shifted. To understand why the decision was so harsh, you must first understand how social stability functioned in a medieval village. Daily life, balanced on patterns that repeated through seasons and years. People woke at the same times, tended the same fields, spoke the same words of blessing before meals, and trusted that the natural world would follow its usual cycles. In such a setting, a ritual like the harvest festival was not merely an occasion to celebrate, but a symbolic reinforcement of predictability in a life dominated by weather, illness, and limited resources. When Alder overturned the long table and injured one of the elders, the disruption went beyond physical mess. It introduced uncertainty. Villagers wondered quietly whether the incident had broken an unwritten rule of the ritual. Some whispered that the honor goose had been angered, because the selection had not been done correctly. Others murmured that Ulrich's growing arrogance had unsettled the balance of the custom. Still others fretted that the coming winter would be harsh, interpreting the chaos as a sign rather than an accident. These were not superstitions born of ignorance, but attempts to interpret an unpredictable world through patterns they trusted. In the dim hours after sunset, the elders gathered in their meeting hall. The room was built of heavy timber beams with a packed earth floor worn smooth by decades of footsteps. A single brazier provided heat. Smoke drifted lazily toward the rafters. The elders sat on low stools, arranged around a carved wooden table that had served for council meetings for as long as anyone could remember. Here decisions were made slowly, not out of indecision, but out of respect for the gravity of communal customs. Elder Hartman, who had injured his arm in the fall, spoke first. He was not an emotional man. His voice rarely rose above a calm murmur, even when addressing urgent matters, but injury during a ritual was significant. It suggested that the process had been disrupted in a meaningful way. As he recounted Alder's behavior, his words were deliberate, as though he was placing each idea carefully in order to avoid drawing rash conclusions. Others added their thoughts. Frau Margie, the oldest among them, reminded the group that rituals were only stable when approached with humility. She believed Ulrich's forceful insistence had unbalanced the ceremony. Elder Matthias disagreed, pointing out that animals were unpredictable and that many processions in the past had involved stubborn geese. Still, he acknowledged that never before had an honor goose attacked the procession and disrupted the communal meal. One elder asked whether the festival should continue unchanged in the following year, perhaps with stricter selection rules. Another suggested the ritual should be simplified, but the room carried an undercurrent of unease. The incident had embarrassed the council in front of the entire village. It had shaken the villagers' trust in the harvest ritual. Most importantly, it had revealed that even the customs they believed to be harmless could become sources of unexpected danger. The debate stretched late into the evening, until the brazier's coals glowed faintly and the hall had grown cold. At last, a consensus formed. The festival would be discontinued. The elders did not reach the decision lightly. They understood that ending a centuries-old ritual would leave a void in the seasonal rhythm, but they also believed the risk of repeating the ceremony outweighed its benefits. To their minds, a tradition that caused injury or disorder had lost the blessing that justified its existence. The next morning, the elders announced their decision in the central square. Villagers listened quietly. Some nodded in agreement. Others stared at the ground. A few exchanged glances tinged with disappointment. The harvest festival had never been grand, but it had been theirs. To lose a ritual, even a simple one, meant losing a piece of the shared identity that bound the community. Ulrich was not present at the announcement. He remained in his house, tending to his flock with a grim determination. His pride had been wounded in front of the entire village, and the cancellation of the festival only deepened his shame, though no elder accused him openly. He knew the incident was partly his fault. He had argued too aggressively. He had pushed tradition to accommodate his sense of authority, and the moment Alder broke free, all of his confidence had turned into something much heavier. For several days, Ulrich avoided the market square and the common well. He asked neighbors to carry messages on his behalf, and sent his sister to barter for supplies. The villagers, for their part, were not cruel. Medieval communities relied on cooperation, not hostility, but people whispered. They spoke of the goose incident when they gathered to grind grain or fetch water. They did not mock Ulrich, yet they repeated the story with the quiet fascination that always follows unexpected events. With the festival cancelled, people wondered what would replace it. Medieval life did not welcome empty spaces. Every season, every task, every ritual had a purpose. Without a harvest festival, when would the community come together to acknowledge their shared labor? When would they mark the transition from growing season to winter hardship? The elders struggled with these questions. A new custom could be created, but new customs felt fragile at first, lacking the weight of time. Meanwhile, the impact of the cancelled festival rippled through the village's rhythms. The communal slaughter of geese had been part of the tradition. Without it, every household had to manage the task on its own schedule. This caused small inconveniences. Some families lacked the necessary tools, others lacked experience. In years past, the elders had supervised to ensure the meat was salted and stored properly. Without their guidance, mistakes happened. One family salted their geese too lightly, and a portion of their winter stores spoiled. Another family waited too long and had to rush the process, producing tough, poorly preserved meat. These inconveniences were not catastrophic, but they underscored the value of traditions people often overlooked. Rituals existed not only for symbolism, but for practicality. They ensured that essential tasks were performed correctly and at the proper time. As winter settled in, the village adapted to its altered rhythms. Snow pressed against the roof edges, narrow paths cut through the whitened fields, smoke curled from chimneys in steady plumes, geese huddled in their pens, their feathers puffed against the cold. Yet beneath this appearance of calm stability, something had shifted. People felt the absence of the festival in subtle ways. They had always gathered together at the end of the harvest. Now, they spent the first weeks of winter apart, tending their individual households with less communal interaction. Ulrich felt the shift more sharply than anyone. His work continued, but without the festival to validate his role, his pride softened into something closer to introspection. He rose before dawn each day to feed the flock, checking their feathers for signs of frostbite, ensuring their water trays remained unfrozen. Goose farming was repetitive and quiet work, giving him hours of stillness to think. His thoughts turned often to the incident. He wondered why Alder had reacted so violently. He wondered whether he had pushed too hard, insisting on the bird selection when he should have respected tradition. He wondered whether the elders blamed him more than they admitted, and he wondered how long the villagers' memories would stretch. In a small community, stories persisted. They shaped reputations for years. As the season turned from deep winter to the slow thaw of early spring, the elders discussed replacing the festival with a simpler communal gathering. Nothing involving animals, nothing involving processions, just a shared meal and a blessing for the coming planting season. But even this idea felt precarious. Without the weight of history, could it truly serve the same purpose? Questions like this lingered. Traditions once broken were difficult to repair. People feared that repeating the ritual would invite misfortune. Others feared that entirely replacing it would erase something important. The village hovered between old habits and new uncertainties. And through all of this, none of the elders, nor Ulrich, nor the villagers fully understood how one frightened goose had reshaped the structure of their seasonal life. They only sensed the change, subtle but persistent, lingering like the memory of a sound long after the echo fades. Yet the elders believed there was more to the incident than a single chaotic afternoon. What deeper meaning did they see in Alder's outburst? And what unspoken fears influenced their final decision to end the ritual forever? When spring finally pushed winter back across the marshes and thawed the ground around the village, the patterns of daily life resumed their familiar shape. Fields were prepared for sowing, tools were repaired. The river, once frozen in patches, regained its slow, steady movement. Yet even as the rhythms of the land returned, something in the village felt slightly different, as though an old melody had lost a familiar note. The absence of the harvest festival lingered, not as a sharp loss, but as a subtle emptiness woven into conversations, routines, and the way people thought about the cycle of seasons. The elders sensed this change most keenly. They met more frequently than usual, gathering in their timber hall after dusk, to discuss how best to guide the village into the new year. The long shadows cast by their tallow candles stretched across the wooden table where countless decisions had been made before. Though the hall itself remained the same, the work carried out inside it seemed heavier than it had in previous years. The elders had broken a tradition that extended back beyond their own memories, and they felt the weight of that choice. The discussions often circled around the same questions. Should they introduce a new communal gathering to mark the end of harvest later in the year? Should they allow families to create their own small customs? Should they attempt to preserve some element of the old ritual without reviving the goose procession? Each suggestion carried risks, and each was met with hesitation. They had once believed that customs were anchors of steadiness, but now they understood how fragile anchors could be. As for the villagers, they responded to the absence of the festival in ways both practical and emotional. Life went on. Fields had to be tended, animals fed, and goods traded. But people talked. They discussed memories of past festivals, telling stories that had never seemed important before. They remembered how children once chased each other with handfuls of grain. They remembered how the elders used to bless the geese before the procession began. They remembered the way families gathered afterward to share a simple meal. These details had always seemed ordinary, but without the festival, they felt oddly distant, as though the past had shifted just out of reach. Children, especially, were confused by the change. They had always looked forward to the procession, not because it was exciting, but because it gave them something to observe during the quiet season, when work slowed. Now they asked their parents why the festival had ended, and parents struggled to provide an answer that satisfied their curiosity. It is difficult to explain to a child why a ritual must be abandoned, especially when the explanation involves pride, accident, and fear of repeating a mistake. Ulrich felt the change more deeply than anyone else. Through spring and summer, he tended his flock with the same steady hands, but there was a persistent heaviness to his work. Every goose he fed reminded him of Alder. Every honk echoed faintly with the memory of that chaotic afternoon. Villagers no longer avoided him, but neither did they forget the incident. People still treated him with courtesy, but the easy warmth that had once defined their interactions had cooled. Medieval communities valued reputation, and once a person became associated with an event that disrupted communal life, that association lingered. Ulrich understood this without resentment. If anything, the experience softened his pride. The arrogance that had led him to insist upon Alder's selection had given way to reflection. He recognized that he had tried to shape tradition according to his own sense of importance, forgetting that customs belonged to the entire community, not to one individual. When he spoke with others at the well or in the market, his words were quieter and more measured than before. He listened more. He explained himself less. In his home, he kept a small wooden token carved by his father. It depicted a goose with its wings partially raised, a simple design shaped with careful strokes of a whittling knife. His father had crafted it when Ulrich was a child, telling him that tending geese required humility, because geese themselves obeyed no one. Ulrich had not understood this at the time, but now the meaning felt almost painfully clear. Each evening, as he finished his tasks, he placed the carving on the table beside the oil lamp, letting the flickering light play across its grain. It reminded him of something he had forgotten for too long. Meanwhile, the elders continued searching for a way to replace the festival. As summer approached, they observed the villagers more closely, noting whether people had found new ways to mark seasonal transitions. Some families gathered privately after the final harvest day to share meals, but these gatherings were small and scattered. Others simply treated the end of the season as another work day. Without a unified ritual, the village felt less cohesive. During midsummer, the elders convened a larger meeting in the central square, inviting anyone who wished to speak. This was unusual. Public gatherings of this sort were rare, reserved for issues that affected the entire community. People arrived slowly, taking seats on benches or standing in small groups beneath the shade of a few old trees. Children sat cross-legged near the edges of the square, curious to hear the discussion. The elders explained that they wished to establish a new custom to replace the harvest festival. They asked for ideas. For a moment, the square remained quiet. Then a baker suggested a communal bread sharing. A carpenter proposed a simple gathering near the well, where blessings could be offered for the coming winter. A shepherd suggested lighting small torches at dusk to mark the turning of the year. None of these ideas involved animals, and none resembled the old goose procession. Still, they represented attempts to restore a sense of shared purpose. As the discussion grew, it became clear that the villagers were hesitant to adopt any suggestion too quickly. People feared repeating the mistake of placing too much weight on a single ritual. They wanted something that would bind them together without inviting misfortune. In the end, no decision was made during that meeting. The elders thanked the villagers for their ideas and promised to continue considering them. When autumn arrived once more, the village found itself facing a familiar moment of transition, but without the structure that once shaped it. Households completed their harvests and began preparing their winter stores. Smoke from drying herbs drifted from some homes. Others salted meat or stored root vegetables in earthen pits. The work was the same as in past years, but the atmosphere was different. There was no procession, no honor goose, no communal gathering to share food and blessings. Still, something remarkable happened. Without planning or formal agreement, households began visiting one another with small offerings. One family brought a few apples to a neighbor. Another offered a small loaf of bread. A third shared a jug of ale. These exchanges were quiet and unremarkable, but they created a sense of connection that felt natural. There was no ritual, no appointed leader, no elaborate preparations, only the simple act of acknowledging that winter was approaching and that neighbors mattered. Even Ulrich participated. On one cool evening, he carried a basket of late-season herbs and a small cured goose breast to the home of the family whose stores had spoiled the previous winter. He did not mention Alder. He did not apologize directly. Instead, he simply offered what he had, and the family accepted with quiet gratitude. Medieval life rarely relied on grand gestures. Instead, Trust was built and rebuilt through small actions repeated over time. As word of these quiet exchanges spread, the villagers began to recognize that they had unknowingly created a new custom. It lacked the ceremony of the old festival, but it had its own subtle power. It allowed people to connect without the pressures of ritual or symbolism. It reminded them that community was not defined by a single event, but by the countless small interactions that filled their days. Over time, the new custom became an expected part of the harvest season. Children grew up participating in it, without knowing anything about the lost procession. The elders, now older and slower, watched with satisfaction as the village settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. Ulrich, too, found a measure of peace. Although the shadow of the old incident never disappeared entirely, it softened with each passing year. People remembered him not as the man who ruined the festival, but as someone who had learned humility through experience. His flock remained among the largest in the village, but he no longer spoke of his geese with pride. Instead, he talked about them the way one speaks of simple responsibilities, neither boasting nor apologizing. Alder, the goose who had caused so much trouble, lived for several more years in Ulrich's care. Ulrich never used the bird for food, nor did he allow anyone else to do so. Some villagers wondered why he kept such a troublesome creature, but Ulrich never explained. Perhaps Alder represented a reminder of the delicate balance between human intention and the unpredictability of animals. Or perhaps Ulrich simply felt responsible for the bird, knowing that Alder had acted from fear rather than malice. And so the village moved forward. The harvest festival, once a fixture of community life, faded into memory. New generations heard only fragments of the story, never quite understanding the full significance. The elders passed away. New leaders emerged. Fields were planted and harvested again and again. Life continued in the steady cycles that define rural history. In the end, the incident became a quiet example of how a single event, caused by one person's pride and one frightened goose, could reshape a tradition and alter the rhythm of an entire community. It showed that customs survive not because they are old, but because they serve the needs of the people who practice them. When they no longer do, they change, even if the change begins with something as small as flapping wings and muddy footprints. Yet, one question remains. If the villagers had understood their custom less rigidly, or if Ulrich had acted with greater humility, might the harvest festival have endured rather than disappeared into history? The morning light drifted slowly across the quiet valley, brushing the tops of the cedar trees with a gentle glow. In the small village, surrounded by rolling fields, a young woman named Amara stepped out of her home and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness settle around her. Every dawn carried a familiar rhythm, yet on this particular day she sensed something different beneath the surface, like an unseen current stirring the air. Amara carried a woven basket on her arm as she walked toward the eastern fields, a place she had visited since childhood. The earth there held stories of her ancestors, stories told through the whisper of tall grass and the distant call of cranes gliding above the marsh. She moved with purpose, but also with wonder, as if each step invited a new understanding. Near the edge of the fields she paused. A soft breeze rose, carrying with it a sound she had never heard before. It was faint, almost like distant humming, but it carried a warmth that made her heartbeat quicken. She looked around, searching for the source, yet nothing around her appeared out of the ordinary. The sky was clear, the trees still, and the fields stretched peacefully in every direction. Drawn by curiosity, Amara followed the sound, letting it guide her deeper into the tall grass. The further she walked, the more the gentle hum grew into a calming resonance, steady and inviting. It was as if the earth itself was calling her towards something she had always been meant to find. Then she saw it. At the very center of the field stood an ancient stone, half covered in moss and glowing faintly with a soft amber radiance. She approached slowly, her breath held in quiet awe. The hum seemed to pulse from within the stone, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Amara felt an unexpected sense of recognition, as though she had been here before in a forgotten dream. She placed her hand upon the warm surface. The moment her skin touched the stone, the hum ceased, and the world fell into a deep and complete silence. For a heartbeat she wondered if she had imagined everything, but then the stone shifted beneath her hand, and a thin line of light opened across its surface. Amara stepped back, eyes wide, as the light grew brighter, and the ancient stone slowly unfurled, like a door awakening from a long sleep. Something waited inside, and as the glow spilled across the field, Amara understood that the quiet life she had known until now was about to change forever. A warm glow spilled from within the opening stone, spreading across the field in soft waves. Amara shielded her eyes for a moment, then lowered her hand as the brilliance eased into a gentle shimmer. Inside the hollowed space stood a narrow passage carved from the same ancient rock, illuminated by threads of light that moved like living rivers along its walls. She hesitated at the entrance. The air felt different here, neither cold nor warm, but alive with a subtle pulse that matched the steady rhythm of her heart. Even the ground beneath her feet seemed to hum faintly, as if welcoming her presence. Amara stepped forward. The moment she crossed the threshold, the stone door closed behind her with a quiet sigh of air. There was no fear, only a deep and growing certainty that she was following a path laid long before her time. The passage curved gently downward, guiding her deeper into the earth. The soft threads of light brightened as she walked, weaving patterns that shifted like the turning pages of an unseen book. As she moved, she noticed something remarkable. The walls were not merely carved but engraved with symbols she had never seen before, symbols that seemed to shimmer with their own quiet life. When she brushed her fingertips along one of them, a soft echo whispered through her mind, a feeling rather than a sound, carrying a sense of welcome. After some time, the narrow corridor widened into a circular chamber. At the center stood a raised platform of smooth stone, and upon it rested a small sphere glowing with a steady amber light. The sphere hovered just above the surface, turning slowly as if suspended by unseen hands. Amara approached the platform, drawn to the sphere by a pull she could neither explain nor resist. The glow warmed her face and filled the chamber with a peaceful calm. She extended her hand, and the sphere brightened, responding to her presence as though it recognized her. The moment her hand hovered above it, the sphere lifted higher and spiraling patterns of light unfurled around it. The chamber filled with soft currents of air that circled her like a gentle wind. Then the sphere spoke, not in words, but in a clear and resonant voice within her mind. "You have been chosen to awaken what was forgotten." Amara's breath caught. The light around the sphere intensified, revealing glimpses of distant places she had never seen, mountains of silver stone, forests glowing with hidden fire, and a sky streaked with colors beyond the known world. The voice returned, calm and steady. "The world beyond your horizon is changing, and you must decide whether to protect what is coming or to turn away." The sphere dimmed, settling back into its gentle amber glow. Amara stood in silence, her heart steady but her thoughts racing. Whatever path lay ahead, she understood one simple truth. Her life would never return to what it had been when the sun rose that morning. By the time you reach the final part of this story, you have already walked beside Amara through two peculiar moments in her otherwise ordinary medieval life. First, the strange discovery in the field, and second, the quiet descent into the carved chamber beneath it. Now, in this last section, we shift from her private experience to the historical consequence that followed, because as often happened in the Middle Ages, one person's quiet and unassuming curiosity could ripple outward and shape decisions, fears, and prohibitions that lasted far beyond their lifetime. To understand this, you must remind yourself of the sort of world Amara lived in. It was a world where mystery was not an abstract concept. It was a daily companion. People watched the sky for signs, traced patterns in animal behavior, and read meaning into the simplest misfortune. And within this world sat a collection of fragile authorities, local priests, landholders, stewards, reeves, and messengers. Their position relied on certainty. Anything that seemed unusual, anything outside the explanations they offered, risked the perception of disorder that, more than anything else, shaped what came next. When Amara emerged from the underground chamber, she did so quietly, slipping back into the daily rhythms of her village. You can picture her walking along the thin lines of earth, separating one patch of barley from the next. The wind would rustle the early growth. Birds, uninterrupted by the affairs of humans, continued their melodic arguments overhead. And if anyone had watched her walk home, they would have seen nothing more remarkable than a tired farm woman brushing dirt from her hands. For a few days, Amara kept the experience to herself. She tended her chores, fetched water, and continued preparing the spring plantings with her neighbors. She even attended Sunday Mass, sitting on the same roughly carved bench she had used since childhood. But the quiet glow of that chamber stayed with her. She remembered every line carved into its walls, and every subtle shift of light that had seemed to breathe with the stone. It felt less like a secret, and more like a burden, one she hoped would lighten with time. Yet history rarely allows people to keep burdens to themselves. The first small disturbance came when the field reeve, a man named Geron, noticed a change in the soil near the stone outcrop. Perhaps he was marking off the field boundaries for tax calculations, or perhaps he was simply curious, but he noticed loosened earth, faint footprints, and a small hollow where the stone had moved. This in itself should have been unremarkable. Stones shifted often with the seasons, but what drew his attention was not the ground, it was Amara. He saw her watching him, not staring in fear or suspicion, but with a quiet worry that caught his notice. And because a reeve's duty included collecting information as much as collecting grain, he asked her directly what she had found there. Many medieval stories begin in this exact way, with a question asked in the wrong tone at the wrong time. Amara tried to answer simply. She said she had noticed the loose earth. She said she had moved the stone to test its weight. She even said she had found a hollow beneath it. But the more she tried to speak plainly, the more she sensed how unusual the experience sounded when stripped to its bare facts. Geron's eyes narrowed because he expected deceit in nearly every conversation, and when he reported the unusual hollow to the parish priest, he did so with a tone of grave concern. That concern was all that was needed. Within days, Father Geron inspected the site himself. He did not descend into the chamber, nor did he try to move the stone. What he saw, or rather what he feared he might see, was enough for him to declare the place unsanctioned, a medieval term, broad enough to cover anything unexplainable, and because he did not understand it, he defined it as a threat. This is an important detail in medieval history. Much of what was later banned, outlawed, condemned, or destroyed was not born from confirmed danger. It was born from uncertain perception. People banned things not because they knew them to be harmful, but because they feared they might be. And so the first formal action taken was not dramatic. Father Duran simply instructed that no one should move stones on the old boundary lines unless supervised. It seemed minor, a small preventative measure, but rules, like seeds, rarely stay the size they begin. Word spread quickly. People began telling stories to pass the time in the evenings. Stories about unusual lights in the fields, about tunnels from forgotten eras, about omens carved into rock by hands long vanished. Most medieval villagers never traveled far from home. Their world of experience was small, so their world of imagination was large, and the more they filled in the spaces around the truth, the farther Amara's private experience drifted from reality. Amara herself said little, but she noticed people watching her as they worked, whispering as she drew water, or pausing their conversations when she approached. The world did not turn hostile, but it grew cautious, as if she had stepped beyond an invisible border and returned with something others could not yet name. Here is where history begins to solidify. Records, scattered, incomplete, and fragmented. Note that, within a season, local authorities issued a decree. It forbade the moving of any boundary stones in the region, without clerical approval. This rule, which might seem insignificant today, became one of the early steps towards standardizing land measurement practices across several medieval parishes. Each rule fed into another, eventually shaping how land disputes were settled, how crops were taxed, and how property was recorded. It all started, according to these small notes, because of one incident involving an untrained woman who disturbed a marked stone. This, then, was the ripple. What Amara had found, a hollow chamber, illuminated minerals, carved symbols from an older culture, was not supernatural at all. Medieval landscapes are full of forgotten chambers, burial mounds, storage pits, mine shafts, and ritual spaces abandoned by earlier societies. The light she described was likely the natural luminescence of certain minerals reacting to fresh air after centuries of containment. The carvings were probably remnants of a pre-Christian tradition, preserved through time by layers of soil and darkness. But what mattered was not the truth of what she found. What mattered was how the people around her responded. The decree spread through neighboring villages. Soon, entire regions banned the shifting of field stones without witness. Later, they banned the unlicensed excavating of soil beyond a certain depth. Still later, they introduced formal methods of marking boundaries through stakes and pits instead of movable rocks. And though the documents do not mention Amara by name, they mention the early cause, a reminder of how quickly a small event becomes a reference point for larger policies. The stone itself was later sealed with mortar and blessed, a practice used less to protect villagers from unseen forces, and more to reassure them that everything unusual had been made ordinary again. Amara never attempted to revisit the chamber. Perhaps she feared the judgment of others. or perhaps she simply understood that the moment had passed. Sometimes history closes the door long before the person does. In her remaining years, Amara returned to the rhythm of daily life. She lived quietly, tended her field, and grew old with the same steady patience that had carried her through her youth. She was not remembered as a visionary or a danger. She was remembered, in those few places where her story survived, as the farmer who found the hollow stone, no more, no less. And yet the rules sparked by her discovery lasted far longer than she did. They shaped how medieval communities handled land boundaries, how they monitored excavation, and how they responded to anything that seemed unusual enough to disturb the order of daily life. Villagers learned to regulate curiosity. They learned to define exploration as risk, and they learned that even the smallest action by an ordinary person could ripple outward until it touched the very structure of their society. As you reflect on this final part of the story, you might wonder what truly caused these bands to endure. Was it the chamber beneath the ground, the glowing minerals, or the ancient carvings? Or was it something far simpler, the fear of uncertainty, the discomfort of the unfamiliar, the instinct to preserve order in a world already fraught with unpredictability? That question is what lingers now, quietly, as the story closes. What other ordinary discoveries might have reshaped entire communities, simply because someone in power feared what they could not understand? When you imagine medieval clothing, your mind might drift toward woolen tunics, rough cloaks, or simple leather boots, shaped more for durability than style. You might picture peasants trudging through mud, nobles wrapped in heavy fabrics, and monks in plain sandals. Yet tucked inside this familiar landscape was a fashion trend so unusual, so impractical, so strangely captivating, that it swept across towns and courts for decades before one man finally took it far enough to earn an enduring place in medieval prohibitions. These were the elongated shoes known as polanes, and their rise and fall tells you a great deal about how something seemingly trivial could lead to surprisingly lasting rules. To understand how these shoes became a problem, you need to picture Europe during the later medieval centuries. Trade routes had opened, goods from faraway lands filtered into local markets. Nobles competed not just in wealth, but in novelty. And as often happens across history, people began searching for new ways to distinguish themselves from the workers who tilled their fields or the soldiers who guarded their lands. Clothing became a kind of spoken language, one stitched in silk, leather, and ornamentation. Through it, people expressed status, aspiration, pride, and sometimes vanity. Shoes, oddly enough, became a central part of this expression. Most shoes across early medieval centuries were plain, round at the toe, and functional. They were made for walking long distances, carrying loads, and surviving cold seasons. But as fashions shifted, noblemen began wearing pointed shoes. At first, the points were modest. They extended just a little farther than the toes, creating a gentle taper. These shoes were not especially impractical, and they did not interfere with daily life. But fashion rarely stops at modest. Once people realized the points could be made longer, they stretched them farther, and once they stretched them farther, people began competing in how far they could go. The toes elongated until they curled upward, sometimes tied to the leg with fine laces to prevent tripping. Soon they grew so long that walking became a challenge, a slow and careful motion requiring delicate balance. The wealthy embraced this awkwardness as a sign that they belonged to a life of privilege. After all, only someone who did not need to work could afford to wear shoes that made work impossible. This brings you to the man whose name appears in several fragmented chronicles, a nobleman known today not for battles or governance, but for making shoe points so long that chroniclers could not help describing him. His name was Lord Henry de Lorme, a minor noble from a region known more for its rolling farmland than its politics. Henry was not especially influential, nor exceptionally wealthy, but he had one ambition: to be noticed. Many medieval nobles lived in a state of quiet rivalry with one another. They compared horses, competed in feasts, and dressed with a level of extravagance that reflected their yearning for recognition. Henry was no exception. Yet, unlike others, he lacked the natural charisma that might draw attention, and so he turned instead to fashion. His obsession with elongated footwear became a defining feature of his public presence. Each year, he found a way to extend the length of his shoes a little more, and each year, he drew more eyes at gatherings and festivals. Descriptions of Henry vary. Some accounts paint him as comical, a man whose vanity exceeded his judgment. Others portray him with sympathetic amusement, as if he were simply a person who had found one harmless indulgence. but nearly all sources agree on two things. His shoe points were the longest in the region, and he walked with the careful, measured steps of someone who had sacrificed stability in the name of display. One chronicler, writing in the flowing style typical of medieval clerks, noted that Henry once arrived at a spring festival wearing shoes whose points extended well past the length of his own forearms. He moved, according to the account, like someone navigating a narrow beam suspended above a river. Every step was a negotiation between balance and pride. Onlookers watched as he lifted each elongated shoe in exaggerated arcs to avoid tangling them in the ground. This spectacle amused some, bewildered others, and irritated a few. Amusement might have remained the only consequence, if not for the fact that Henry introduced a degree of disruption to the daily order of life. At gatherings, his shoes took up space on crowded benches. When he approached altars during religious ceremonies, he had to maneuver carefully to avoid knocking items aside. During formal dances, he sometimes tripped or entangled the footwear of others, and as the points grew longer, he found himself increasingly unable to perform simple gestures of courtesy. Still, disruptive fashion alone would not have changed law. What pushed the matter toward legislation was a particular incident that took place in a narrow hall of a local manor during an autumn feast. The hall was crowded. The scent of roasted meat hung in the air, mingling with the warmth of torches and the layered sounds of conversation. Henry arrived late, stepping inside with a confidence that belied the unwieldy length of his footwear. His shoes had reached a new extreme. They extended forward in narrow, hardened leather curves, held up by delicate cords tied to his knees. As he walked into the hall, the room fell into a brief silence. Then the quiet laughter of guests rose around him. Henry attempted to bow to the host, but in doing so he misjudged how the long points would respond. The left shoe point curved downward under its own weight, struck the floor, and slid sideways. Henry stumbled. As he tried to regain balance, his right foot slid as well, causing the long curve of the shoe to swing outward. In that motion, the hardened leather struck a servant who was carrying a tray of dishes. The servant stumbled, the dishes crashed, and an entire table fell into disarray. What happened next became the talk of the region. Some said Henry fell and sprawled across the floor like a toppled scarecrow, his elongated shoes pointing in opposite directions. Others said he merely sank to his knees, flustered and embarrassed. A few accounts, likely exaggerated, described nobles stepping aside to avoid being caught in the arc of his swinging shoes. What mattered was not the exact details. What mattered was the outcome. The lord of the manor, embarrassed by the disruption and persuaded by murmured complaints from guests, declared that such shoes posed a public inconvenience and should be restricted. His declaration was not formal law, but in the medieval world, the decisions of a local lord could spread quickly. Priests echoed the sentiment, framing elongated footwear as symbols of vanity. Guilds began discouraging their production, and within a short time, several regions adopted rules limiting the allowable length of shoe points. This moment marked the beginning of a broader cultural shift. Elongated shoes continued to exist, but restrictions grew. The points could extend only as far as social rank allowed, and commoners were not permitted to wear them at all. Gradually the fashion faded, replaced by more practical styles. Lord Henry himself retreated somewhat from public spectacle. Sources suggest he eventually shortened his shoes, perhaps recognizing that his pursuit of attention had led to unintended consequences. He lived out the rest of his life quietly, remembered not as a reformer or as a figure of political influence, but as the man whose enthusiasm for pointed footwear helped spark one of the more unusual medieval bands. As you settle into this story, you might notice that the deeper current running beneath it is not really about shoes. Instead, it reveals how quickly everyday life could become shaped by personal actions in the medieval world. A single nobleman, motivated by pride and a desire to be seen, wore a pair of shoes that were simply too long, and from that moment, rules formed, customs shifted, and a fashion trend fell out of favor. But it leaves you with a quiet question at the end of this first section, one that lingers in the calm space of historical reflection. If a single nobleman's extravagant shoes could reshape local law, what other small choices from this era might have carried consequences far larger than anyone realized at the time? When you step back into the world that surrounded Lord Henry de Lorme, you return to a medieval society balanced on thin lines of order and expectation. A single disturbance, however small, could tilt that balance. What seemed like a trivial fashion choice could be interpreted as an affront to custom, an insult to religious discipline, or even a sign that society was drifting toward indulgence. And in a culture shaped so strongly by perception, the ripple that began in one manor hall did not end there. It travelled outward, gathering meaning that the original moment never intended. To understand this second part of the story, you must imagine how information spread across medieval communities. There were no printed notices, no newspapers, and no formal channels. News travelled by word of mouth, carried by merchants, travellers, servants, and clerics. Each person added something to the story, smoothing over gaps or embellishing details. Facts shifted like sand with the wind, settling into new shapes by the time they reached another village. And so the incident involving Henry and his famously elongated shoes moved from manor to marketplace, and from marketplace to church porch. With each retelling, the scene grew a little more dramatic. Some described the fallen dishes as an entire feast brought to ruin. Others claimed a noblewoman tripped and injured her wrist. A few went so far as to declare that Henry's shoes had endangered a child. It did not matter whether any of this was true. What mattered was that people were listening. Fashion had been a frequent source of tension in medieval life. Clerics often preached against ostentation. Guild leaders disliked trends that forced them to produce intricate work with little additional pay. Peasants resented any display that reminded them of their own limited circumstances. Even nobles, though outwardly tolerant of extravagant dress, quietly judged one another. Everyone lived under the gaze of someone else. This created an environment where a trend could shift from acceptable to problematic almost overnight, and Henry's stumble provided the spark many had been waiting for. One of the earliest recorded reactions came from a parish priest named Father Laurus, who delivered a sermon shortly after hearing the tale. In his message, he spoke not of shoes specifically, but of excess. He described the dangers of pride, of behaviors that called attention to themselves, and of ignoring the humility expected of Christians. He never mentioned Henri by name, yet those who had heard the gossip knew exactly whom he meant. In a society where sermons shaped opinion as strongly as local politics, this moment carried weight. From there, the matter expanded into the realm of guild regulations. Shoemakers in several towns began receiving inquiries from local officials, asking about the effort and materials required to construct excessively long points. A few guild leaders complained openly that such shoes were impractical, costly, and dangerous. They claimed that the work required to shape, stiffen, and support the long tips distracted from the production of functional footwear. They argued that such shoes had become not only a frivolity but a burden. Practical concerns mixed with moral ones. Fashion was no longer simply a way to show status. It had become, in the eyes of many, a sign that society was sliding into vanity. This tension grew until it reached the courts of higher nobles, some of whom held jurisdiction over multiple villages. When they heard that elongated shoes had caused a disturbance during a feast, they viewed it not as a curiosity but as a potential breach of decorum. Medieval nobles were protective of ceremony, for it shaped their authority. To disrupt order during a gathering was to place personal expression above hierarchy, and that was something few noble households tolerated. One noblewoman, Lady Eleanor of Mareth, reportedly ordered that anyone entering her hall must wear footwear that allowed them to walk without assistance. She issued the rule not out of cruelty, but out of annoyance. And because local customs often reflected the decisions of those in power, her preference soon became an expectation among the surrounding population. From there, the matter reached the courts of church councils. Clerical letters began circulating, warning that extreme fashions encouraged vanity and weakened discipline. These letters were not aimed solely at shoes, but elongated points were the most visible example. Priests read these letters aloud during gatherings, reinforcing the notion that indulgence in fashion could lead people astray. As you imagine this moment, you can see how each group added its own concerns, until the matter grew larger than itself. What began as a nobleman's stumble had become a symbol of moral decline, and symbols, once created, take on lives of their own. Meanwhile, Henry himself faced increasing scrutiny. People watched him not with amusement anymore, but with a kind of weary impatience. They expected him to learn from his mishap. They expected him to shorten his shoes, conform to custom, and stop drawing unnecessary attention. But Henry, caught between humiliation and pride, hesitated. He shortened his shoes slightly, perhaps hoping to appear compliant without fully surrendering the distinction he had cultivated. Yet any lingering affection for his fashion faded when a second incident occurred. This event took place not in a manor hall but in a marketplace. Henri, passing through on a routine visit, walked along a row of stalls. His shoes were still long enough to draw notice, though not as extreme as before. A strong wind swept through the street. One of the stall coverings billowed. A merchant stepped back to secure it. Henri, adjusting his direction, misjudged the space. The curled tip of his shoe caught the edge of a basket, pulling it from its place and scattering its contents across the ground. This time the basket contained eggs, a valuable commodity for the vendor. The eggs cracked against the cobblestones. The merchant, who had struggled through a poor season, reacted with understandable frustration. Voices rose. Onlookers gathered. Though Henri apologized, the damage was done. The crowd, already predisposed to judge him, muttered about foolish fashions and unnecessary risks. The merchant himself declared that no one should be allowed to wear anything so impractical in a market where balance and space were already limited. It was not the severity of the moment that mattered. It was the pattern. 2 disruptions, each tied to the same fashion. 2 public scenes in which indulgence had interfered with daily life. When word of this second incident spread, local officials took it as evidence that further trouble might follow, and in the medieval world, where prevention was valued as highly as justice, they acted quickly. Village councils began drafting small ordinances, restricting the length of shoe points. In some places, only nobles were permitted to wear any extended points at all. In others, the points could extend no farther than the width of a palm. In regions with stricter views, elongated shoes were banned entirely. Chroniclers recorded that these rules were justified by both practical and moral concerns. Excessively long points were said to interfere with mobility, distract from solemn ceremonies, and encourage vanity. Some claimed they caused unnecessary waste of leather, a valuable resource. Others pointed out that the cords used to keep the points aloft resembled vanity straps used in older pagan traditions, though this association had little historical basis. As these laws spread, the culture around footwear shifted. People who had once admired extravagant shoe points now viewed them with suspicion. Shoemakers adapted their designs, producing footwear more suitable for walking on uneven ground, climbing stairs, and performing labor, and gradually, elongated points faded into memory, replaced by broader, sturdier shapes. As for Henri, his reputation never fully recovered. Though he was not exiled or punished, he became an example. Parents warned their children of the foolish noble, who valued attention over sense. Priests cited him when preaching humility. Shoemakers mentioned him when explaining why the new regulations existed. Over time, his name faded, but the story remained. This is how medieval bans often formed, not through grand decrees or sweeping movements, but through small incidents magnified by gossip, moral concern, and the collective desire to preserve order. As this second section closes, one question quietly forms in your mind. If a fashion trend could shift from admired to forbidden because of a few public missteps, what other medieval customs were shaped, not by necessity, but by the stories people chose to tell about them? The snowfall eased as dawn approached, leaving a pale silver glow over the mountains. Akira climbed the final ridge with slow and deliberate breaths, feeling the cold, thin air tighten against his lungs. Every step reminded him that this journey was never about the summit itself, but about the person he had been forced to become while reaching for it. He reached a narrow ledge where the wind softened, almost as if the mountain were offering a rare moment of stillness. Akira placed his hand on the ancient stone and bowed his head. The memory of his teacher's final lesson settled over him, like the falling snow, a warrior's path. His teacher had said, is not measured by trophies or praise, but by the quiet strength forged inside the heart. Akira stood tall and allowed the silence to speak. He felt the weight of past failures, past victories, and past doubts melt into a single truth. He had chased mastery, discipline, and self-understanding with the same stubborn fire that once kept him awake through long winter nights. Yet now, standing at the highest point he had ever reached, he realized the journey had never been about conquering the mountain. It had been about conquering the small storms within. A faint warmth flickered inside him, something deeper than pride and steadier than ambition. It was acceptance, not of defeat, not of triumph, but of the endlessly unfinished nature of becoming oneself. Akira whispered a quiet vow into the wind, promising to return not because he needed the mountain, but because the climb itself had taught him who he was becoming. As the sun rose and painted the snow with soft gold, Akira began his descent. His steps were lighter, not because the path was easier, but because he no longer carried the heavy expectation of who he thought he should be. He carried instead the calm certainty of a man who finally understood that growth is a lifelong ascent, shaped by every fall and every rise. And for the first time in many years, he felt ready to begin again. The evening sun drifted low over the quiet coastline, washing the sky with soft copper light. Mana walked along the narrow path above the cliffs, listening to the steady rhythm of the waves below. Each step carried a mix of anticipation and calm, as though the sea itself were guiding her towards something she had long avoided facing. She stopped near an old weathered bench that overlooked the water. Her grandmother used to sit there, watching the horizon, as if reading the secrets written across the endless blue. Hannah placed her hand on the rough wood and felt a familiar ache rise in her chest. This place held memories she had spent many seasons trying to bury beneath work, noise, and distraction. A light breeze lifted her hair and carried the scent of salt and seagrass. Hannah closed her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to sit and simply breathe. The world around her softened, and the tension she had carried for so long began to loosen, thread by thread. Her grandmother had once told her that the sea never hides truth. It reveals it slowly, gently, through patience. Hannah had been too busy, too restless, too determined to outrun her own uncertainty. But now, sitting on that old bench, she realized she could no longer ignore the quiet voice that had followed her through every year of her life. A deep stillness settled inside her, not silence born from emptiness, but silence born from understanding. She knew this return was not about revisiting the past. It was about acknowledging the part of herself she had abandoned along the way. The waves continued their endless conversation below, and Hannah felt their rhythm steady her heartbeat. She did not yet know what she would discover on this journey, but she knew it had finally begun. Hannah remained on the cliff for a long while, watching the tide sweep in and out as though measuring time itself. She had returned to this stretch of coastline to understand the choices that had been made long before her. Choices that shaped not just her family, but the small coastal village itself. Generations of fishermen, weavers, and traders had lived here quietly, following rhythms dictated by wind, waves, and the slow cycle of the seasons. And in that stillness, Hannah began to see the threads that connected her life to theirs. She rose from the bench and moved along the edge of the cliff, careful with each step on the uneven stones. Below, the water shimmered with hints of green and grey. Fishermen's boats, small and weathered, rested against the harbour, tied with fraying ropes. Nets hung from poles to dry, each one telling a story of struggle, patience, and persistence. This village had always been one of endurance. Life here had never been easy, but it had always been shaped by the quiet, repetitive labour that carried a family through winter and storm. As Hannah walked, her thoughts turned to her grandmother's stories. She remembered the tales of ancestors who had kept the village alive through plague, famine, and storms that threatened to erase everything. There had been no glory, no great battles, no dramatic triumphs. Yet the survival of the village itself was a testament to human resilience. The ordinary heroism of daily work repeated over decades. Her grandmother's voice seemed to echo across the cliffs. The sea takes what it must, but those who learn its rhythms endure. The path wound downward toward the small cove, where the old fish processing house still stood. It had been abandoned for years, the wooden beams bleached by sun and salt. Hannah stepped carefully inside, noting the worn planks beneath her feet. She ran her hand over the rough surfaces, imagining the hands that had prepared nets, gutted fish, and salted the catch for storage. Each mark in the wood, each worn groove, was a testament to the countless ordinary days that had preserved this place and the families tied to it. In a corner she discovered a faded journal tucked beneath a loose plank. Its pages were brittle, ink blurred by time and moisture. She opened it carefully and began reading. The entries were not filled with grand achievements, but with meticulous notes on weather patterns, fish migrations and tides. They recorded which nets worked best in which conditions, how to store the catch during stormy months, and which days were most favourable for repair work. Each line was precise, repetitive, and painstakingly detailed. It was a record not of glory but of survival, of knowledge passed quietly from one person to another so that life could continue. Hannah realized that the journal was not extraordinary because of what it told, but because of what it represented. Here was a chronicle of ordinary labor, methodically preserved, showing that even the most mundane actions had consequences that stretched across time. The writer, perhaps a fisherman or their spouse, had not sought recognition. There were no signatures, no titles, no mention of lineage. Yet this small record allowed the community to endure. Without such diligence, the village might have been lost to storms, hunger, or the shifting tides of history. Sitting among the timbers, Hannah felt a strange sense of connection. She understood that her own life, with its worries and distractions, was part of a much larger story. The patterns of endurance were not always visible in grand events, but they shaped everything quietly, persistently. For generations, villagers had survived not by heroic acts, but by careful observation, patience, and consistency. And now, by returning here, Hannah could witness that continuity firsthand. The wind rose sharply, lifting strands of her hair and carrying a spray of salt across the room. She closed the journal and held it to her chest, understanding that her journey was not about changing history or rewriting it. It was about seeing it fully, appreciating the subtle threads that connected past and present. Every detail she had overlooked before, the placement of a plank, the curve of a net, the marks on a stone, carried meaning. Every small act of care, diligence, and attention had mattered, preserving life across decades and centuries. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the cove, Hannah made her way back up the path. She paused at the cliff's edge, letting the wind press against her face and the horizon stretch endlessly before her. She realized that the quiet, ordinary work of generations was not dull, it was powerful. It shaped societies, preserved communities, and allowed individuals to live meaningful lives, even when history seemed unremarkable. And yet, for all its importance, it could so easily be forgotten, misinterpreted, or overlooked. Hannah understood that she had a choice. She could leave these stories buried, lost to time like so many ordinary acts that never found their way into books or songs, or she could carry them forward, remembering the rhythms, the labor, and the resilience of the people who had come before her. By acknowledging the quiet endurance of those lives, she could ensure that their lessons, though subtle and sometimes mundane, remained present in her own life and in the lives of those who would follow. As she descended the cliff path toward the village, a question lingered in her mind, gentle and persistent. How many other histories, just as vital and just as unremarkable, had been lost to time because no one paused long enough to notice? And how much of our present is shaped by the unseen care, the repeated labor, and the ordinary choices of those who lived long before us? Hannah knew she would spend the rest of her journey seeking answers, not to rewrite history, but to witness it, understand it, and let its quiet lessons guide her own path. The following morning, Hannah returned to the cliffs with a sense of quiet determination. The journal she had discovered in the old fish processing house rested in her satchel, its brittle pages held together by fraying threads. She did not intend to publicize it or transform it into a grand story. Her goal was simpler: to understand the people who had lived here, the rhythm of their days, and the subtle ways in which ordinary labor had shaped the survival of their community. As she walked along the narrow path, the wind carried the soft cries of gulls, and the waves struck the rocks below with a gentle, unceasing pulse. The same sea that had challenged generations of villagers now served as a teacher of patience and endurance. Hannah thought about the countless individuals who had risen at dawn, mended nets, hauled fish, and repaired boats with the same quiet diligence she had seen in the journal. Their lives were not marked by dramatic events, battles, or wealth, but by repetition, observation, and care. And in that she recognized a profound lesson. History is not only preserved in grand narratives, but in the careful attention to ordinary life. Hannah stopped at a flat stone overlooking the water, and sat, feeling the wind press lightly against her face. She opened the journal, and read once more. A simple note, written in neat, deliberate handwriting, caught her attention. "The sea rewards patience. The careless lose more than they know." She smiled softly. This sentence, so brief and seemingly mundane, carried the weight of generations. It reflected a worldview shaped not by conquest or spectacle, but by sustained, mindful effort, a philosophy of survival that had allowed a small coastal village to endure when others had vanished. She thought about the concept of time as experienced by these villagers. For them, life was measured in tides, harvest cycles, and the slow progression of seasons. Their concerns were immediate yet repetitive: repairs, provisions, and preparation for the storms that came without warning. There was little room for error, yet they acted without panic, relying on routines developed over decades. Hannah realized that the extraordinary element in their lives was not a single heroic act, but the accumulation of countless ordinary acts that collectively preserved existence. The sun rose higher, illuminating the distant horizon. Hannah felt the gentle ache in her legs and the stiffness in her back, reminders of her own human limitations. Yet she also felt a deep connection to those who had walked these paths before her. She imagined a young villager centuries ago, tracing nets along the cove, noting the angle of the sun, or marking the high water line with a careful hand. Each small observation contributed to the long chain of knowledge that had enabled the community to persist. Hannah stood and let the wind swirl around her. She understood now that witnessing history was not about finding singular moments of triumph or catastrophe. It was about recognizing continuity, the quiet acts that ripple across generations, often unseen and unremarked upon, yet fundamentally shaping life itself. The survival of the village was a testament to human resilience, resourcefulness, and the patience required to endure a world governed by forces both predictable and unpredictable. As she descended back toward the village, Hannah considered how many other lives, small and ordinary, had contributed to the survival of their communities. How many histories had gone unnoticed, hidden in the routine, in the daily repetition of labor and care, and how much of the world as it exists today is a product of countless unnoticed efforts, preserved through observation and diligence. Reaching the village, she paused and looked back at the cliffs. The cove, the cliffs, and the waves below seemed unchanged, yet she sensed that the act of observing had altered something within her. She carried the weight of recognition, the acknowledgement that ordinary lives, while often invisible to history, were powerful in their cumulative effect. Hannah understood that while history often favors dramatic events, it is the quiet perseverance of ordinary people that truly sustains communities across generations. The lesson settled in her quietly. Like the ebbing tide, the extraordinary resides in the ordinary. The lives of those who labor carefully, patiently, and persistently shape the continuity of society. Their stories, though often unrecorded, ripple through time, quietly influencing the present and future. And in acknowledging these small, enduring efforts, one begins to understand the subtle yet profound forces that have preserved humanity through centuries of challenge and change. As she walked into the village square, Hannah felt a gentle, reflective calm. She had begun this journey seeking answers, and though many questions remained, one truth had become clear: the persistence of ordinary people, their careful observations, and their patient labor are the hidden threads of history. Without them, no grand narrative, no chronicled event, no celebrated hero would endure. History, she realized, is often hidden in plain sight, quietly waiting for those willing to notice. And as she settled into the familiar rhythms of village life once more, she carried with her the thought that would linger long after this moment. How many unseen acts, small and consistent, continue to shape the world today, just as they did centuries ago? In the quiet streets of a medieval market town, the sounds of daily life carried far and wide: the clatter of wooden carts on cobblestones, the faint clang of a blacksmith hammering metal, and the low murmur of merchants bargaining created a constant, almost hypnotic rhythm. Among these ordinary sounds, the human voice was usually reserved for work, calling out goods, instructing apprentices, or exchanging hurried greetings. Singing, however, was something different. It was a deviation from routine, an interruption of order, and as the townspeople would soon discover, sometimes a source of serious conflict. The story begins with a minstrel named Jorin, a man of middling reputation, whose presence in the town was at once tolerated and tolerated poorly. Minstrels were common in medieval towns, traveling from village to village, offering news, stories, and songs for a few coins or a meal. Most were quiet, careful to avoid trouble, and skilled enough to please without provoking anyone. Jorin, however, was unusual, not because of talent or ambition, but because of temperament. He had a voice that could carry across streets, rising above market noise, and he sang whatever he pleased, regardless of season, festival, or social circumstance. At first, the townspeople found him charming. Children followed him along the narrow lanes, clapping in time with his tunes. Shopkeepers occasionally left coins in his hat, and the tavern keeper offered him ale in exchange for a song. But Jorin's habits quickly grew more disruptive. He favored long, repetitive songs that stretched across hours, often beginning early in the morning when merchants were setting up stalls or late in the evening when the town sought quiet. His lyrics, too, carried an irreverent humor that poked at local authority figures, criticized their judgments, and mocked minor mistakes in public performances. The first serious complaint came from the town council, convened in the modest stone hall near the center of the market. Council members were responsible for maintaining order and enforcing local regulations, and they viewed Jorin's behavior as a minor but growing nuisance. One member noted that repeated disruptions affected trade, distracted apprentices, and interfered with worship. Another pointed out that the minstrels' songs by mocking local authorities could erode respect and invite disorder. The council deliberated and decided to issue a mild warning. Jorin was permitted to perform, but only during designated hours, and he must avoid songs that could be interpreted as offensive or satirical toward any townspeople. On paper, this seemed reasonable. In practice, it set the stage for ongoing conflict. Jorin paid little heed to the warning. He believed his art was a gift, a freedom of expression that transcended the mundane concerns of governance. On the following market day, he arrived with his lute, tuning the strings with deliberate slowness before launching into a song that satirized a local official's habit of counting coins multiple times. The melody carried through the square, drawing a small crowd, and as predicted, it provoked murmurs of discontent. Shopkeepers grumbled, a baker shook his head. Children laughed obliviously, but the council member targeted in the song was furious, marching into the square to demand that the performance stop. This incident was the catalyst for a series of increasingly restrictive regulations. Council minutes, preserved in fragmentary form, show that Jorin's performances were soon formally restricted. The volume, location and duration of his songs were all regulated. Town ordinances began to specify that singing in public spaces without permission could result in fines or temporary detention. By the end of the season, the town had created one of the earliest recorded examples of a ban on unregulated public singing in its region. The implications were broader than anyone realized at the time. A single minstrel, by exercising his personal freedom and drawing attention to authority figures, had inadvertently reshaped the cultural landscape. Future traveling performers learned quickly to seek permission, limit their volume, and avoid satire. Public spaces became quieter, more orderly, and less prone to disruption, but also less expressive. Citizens grew accustomed to a rhythm of life, where individual creativity had to fit within predefined boundaries. Jorin, for his part, did not stop entirely. He adapted his performances, lowering the volume and choosing songs more carefully. He continued to entertain, but the spontaneity that had once defined his art was gone. What remained was a testament to the power of a single individual to provoke lasting change, even in a small and otherwise unremarkable town. The story closes this first section with a lingering reflection. In a society that prized order and hierarchy, the voice of one irreverent individual became a catalyst for legal regulation and social conformity. And though the laws were mundane, fines, restrictions, and limited hours, the precedent they established endured, subtly shaping the boundaries of public expression for decades. As you consider the events of this first section, one question arises: how often in history has a single person's everyday choices triggered rules that would quietly guide the lives of entire communities for generations? After the initial confrontation with Jorin, the town settled into a tense and measured rhythm. The public square, once filled with spontaneous music, chatter, and laughter, became noticeably quieter. The tavern still offered entertainment, but it was controlled and predictable. Merchants still set up stalls, children still ran between them, but the air no longer carried the improvisational joy that had once punctuated the daily market. In effect, the town had begun to trade vibrancy for order, and the cost was subtle but enduring. Council records, painstakingly maintained in ink on fragile parchment, reveal that the restrictions on singing quickly expanded. First came rules limiting the hours during which a performance could occur. Singing before sunrise or after dusk was forbidden, a measure justified by concerns over noise, sleep disruption, and potential conflicts between neighbors. Next came regulations governing location. Minstrels could perform only in designated areas, usually the far edges of the square, where their voices would carry minimally. Finally, there were limits on content. Satire or criticism, even in mild jest, was strictly prohibited. Officials argued that mockery could undermine authority and provoke disputes among citizens. These ordinances may seem minor, even trivial, but their effects were profound. The square lost a vital part of its character. Citizens had grown accustomed to the predictability of sound, but the vibrancy of the town had diminished. Life became quieter, more restrained, and more orderly. Children still played, but their games were less spontaneous, and even celebrations were measured carefully against official hours and designated spaces. Music existed, but only within limits, like a river channeled into a narrow canal. Jorin adapted as best he could. He lowered his voice, avoided satire, and followed the newly imposed schedule. Yet, despite his compliance, the townspeople's perception of him shifted. Once a figure of charm and entertainment, he became a symbol of disorder narrowly controlled. Parents warned children to avoid provoking him, not because he intended harm, but because his reputation had grown in proportion to the restrictions placed upon him. Even when he performed within the rules, a subtle tension lingered. The town had learned that one individual's deviation could ripple outward, affecting the daily life of all. The restrictions also affected other minstrels. Travelers who had previously moved freely through towns found themselves facing inquiries, permissions, and fines. Performance became bureaucratized. The simple joy of unplanned song and storytelling was replaced with regulated, approved content. Musicians had to submit their intended repertoire in advance to authorities, and in some cases the council maintained logs of performers' previous behavior to determine suitability. The broader impact was not only cultural but psychological. Citizens became conditioned to avoid activities that could draw attention or disrupt order. Public gatherings, once occasions for communal interaction and creativity, became carefully orchestrated events. The rhythm of everyday life was preserved, but at the expense of spontaneity and freedom. In attempting to prevent disruption caused by one individual, the town had constrained the behaviors of everyone. Yet, even within these limitations, subtle forms of resilience persisted. Children hummed tunes quietly as they walked to school. Apprentices shared whispered songs in workshops. A few daring minstrels experimented with clever harmonies that avoided official censure, but still brought life to corners of the town, otherwise subdued. These small acts were a reminder that human creativity, while constrained, finds ways to endure. Historians later noted that the town's reaction to Jorin's behavior mirrored broader patterns across medieval Europe. Communities often valued order and predictability over individual expression. When one person disrupted established norms, councils and authorities acted decisively to prevent repetition, even if the measures impacted the broader population. In many ways, this incident illustrates the medieval tension between personal freedom and social stability, a tension that exists in varying forms in human societies to this day. Jorin himself became a quiet observer of these changes. No longer the irreverent, attention-grabbing performer, he moved carefully among the townspeople, mindful of their expectations and the rules that now governed his every note. His role in the community shifted from entertainer to symbol. He represented both the potential of individual expression and the consequences of overstepping societal boundaries. Even after Jorin's passing, the ordinances he had inadvertently inspired remained in place. Minstrels continued to seek permission before performing, and the cultural vibrancy of the square remained subdued. The incident became a cautionary tale, whispered from one generation to the next, a reminder that personal actions, however small, could shape the lives and liberties of an entire community. And so, as the years passed, the town became known less for its lively public gatherings and more for its orderliness and predictability. The market square was tidy, the streets quiet, and the town itself preserved from conflict. Yet beneath that order, one could still sense the absence of spontaneous song, the quiet gap left by the singular minstrel, whose voice had been both celebrated and constrained. As you reflect on this second section, the lingering thought remains clear. The balance between freedom and order is delicate, and one person's choices can ripple outward in ways that shape not only immediate circumstances, but also the culture of an entire community for generations. Years passed, and the town's streets settled into a rhythm of quiet routine. The market square, once filled with spontaneous music, laughter, and the occasional outburst of song, retained an ordered calm. Jorin, the minstrel whose voice had once carried across the town, was long gone, yet his presence lingered like a subtle echo, preserved in the ordinances that continued to govern public performances and in the whispered stories told by parents and shopkeepers alike. Even though the restrictions had subdued public song, they did not extinguish the human spirit. Inside homes, within the walls of workshops, and in the quiet moments of the evening, music persisted. Families hummed tunes while preparing meals. Apprentices whispered melodies to each other as they worked. Children invented rhythms with sticks and stones. The town had learned to adapt. Creativity survived, but it was now private, contained and careful. The community had discovered that culture could persist even when public expression was limited, though at the cost of visibility and spontaneity. In reflecting on the town's transformation, historians centuries later would point out the lessons embedded in these events. One individual, by acting without heed to local norms, had inspired regulations that shaped daily life for generations. A singular act of disruption had become the catalyst for a broader cultural shift, demonstrating how personal behavior could ripple outward and influence society in profound and lasting ways. Jorin's legacy was paradoxical. He had reminded the town of the beauty and vitality that music could bring, but he had also revealed the fragility of communal tolerance. The response of the town, rules, schedules, fines, ensured order, but suppressed a certain form of freedom. And while the community thrived in its predictable rhythms, there remained a sense of absence, a quiet space once filled with unregulated expression that could no longer be fully restored. This tension between freedom and regulation, between individual expression and communal stability, is not confined to medieval towns. Across history, societies have continually faced similar choices. Leaders and councils often act decisively to preserve order, especially when a single person's actions threaten to disrupt established routines. The immediate benefits of such interventions, peace, safety, and predictability, are clear, yet the subtle costs, the suppression of spontaneity, creativity, and sometimes joy, are often less visible, but equally real. The townspeople, though largely unaware of it at the time, were participants in a lesson that would echo through centuries, that culture is shaped as much by what is restrained as by what is allowed. Every song that went unsung, every story that went unshared, contributed to a quiet reshaping of their social world, and though the lessons were subtle, they were enduring. Looking back on Jorin's life and the regulations his behavior inspired, one is reminded of the fragile interplay between the individual and the community. One voice, carried too loudly, had forced an entire town to reconsider its values. The results were neither entirely positive nor entirely negative. The town endured, survived, and even thrived, but it did so at the cost of a certain kind of openness, a space in which creativity and unpredictability could flourish without fear. As you imagine the square, once bustling with spontaneous music, now quiet under the shadow of laws shaped by a single minstrel, you are reminded that history often unfolds in these quiet, almost invisible ways. Grand battles and monumental events dominate chronicles, but it is the ordinary, the repetitive, and sometimes the inconvenient acts of individuals that often leave the most enduring mark. And so the story closes with a gentle reflection. What seems trivial in the moment, one singer's disregard for schedule, one act of minor disruption, can ripple outward across a community, reshaping culture, behavior, and the very rhythm of daily life. The medieval laws against public singing were more than restrictions. They were a testament to the power of one individual to influence the lives of many, and to the subtle, enduring consequences of choices made in ordinary circumstances. And as the market square of that quiet town fades into memory, one question lingers softly. How many of the rules and routines that govern your own world today exist because of small, ordinary acts that once disrupted life in ways no one could have fully anticipated? In the quiet stone halls of medieval churches, sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting color across worn flagstones. The air was thick with incense, the faint smell of beeswax from candles, and the whispered prayers of parishioners who had come seeking guidance, solace, or simple routine. These spaces were meant to embody reverence, order, and sanctity. They were places where the spiritual and the temporal intersected, where life outside the walls, its noise, its hunger, its chaos, was set aside, even for a few moments. Yet human impulses, especially those of hunger, could be difficult to restrain. This is how the story begins, with a nobleman named Sir Ulrich de Vienne, a man accustomed to feasts, privileges, and indulgence, who found himself attending a morning mass that extended longer than anticipated. The sermon was long, filled with moral instruction and complex theological discourse. Ulrich, unaccustomed to sitting quietly without diversion, had brought with him a small meal of bread and cheese, perhaps thinking it would not be noticed. At first, the act seemed minor, almost imperceptible. Ulrich unwrapped his bread quietly, tore small pieces, and nibbled. His companion, a squire used to etiquette, leaned in a whisper to remind him that the church was not a place for dining. Ulrich waved him away, confident that no offense had been given. But as the minutes passed and the congregation's attention remained fixed on the sermon, the sound of paper, rustling, and faint chewing began to carry. A few parishioners noticed. A few turned their heads, curious and slightly irritated. The situation escalated when a crumb fell onto the flagstones, and a candle flickered near the edge of Ulrich's improvised plate. One of the priests, focused on the ritual at the altar, caught sight of the disruption. The nobleman's casual disregard for the sanctity of the space was interpreted not merely as rudeness, but as a moral failing, a tangible example of indulgence and irreverence that threatened the decorum of the entire congregation. The priest moved forward, gesturing discreetly, then speaking sharply once Ulrich persisted in his nibbling. "Sir, this is not a hall for your meals. You may eat elsewhere, but not here." Ulrich, affronted by the public reprimand, attempted to defend himself. He argued that his meal was small, that it caused no harm, and that his attention remained fixed on the sermon. Yet his defense only amplified the disruption. Voices around him murmured. Some laughed quietly at the audacity, while others expressed offense. What had been a quiet indulgence became a matter of social and moral concern. Word of the incident spread quickly through the town, first among clergy, then to guild members, then to local nobility. Letters were written, meetings were convened. Questions arose: how should holy spaces be treated? To what extent could individual needs or conveniences be accommodated? Was this an isolated lapse or a symptom of declining respect for sacred norms? The resulting discussion was not merely about manners, it was about order, authority, and communal responsibility. Churches were central to daily life, serving as more than places of worship. They were sites for announcements, legal oaths, and community gatherings. If one individual could treat the space as convenient for personal indulgence, what precedent might that set? If nobles were allowed small transgressions, might others follow, eroding the boundaries that defined sacred and profane? By the end of the month, the town council and church authorities agreed on a formal ordinance. Eating inside the church was strictly forbidden, for nobles and commoners alike. The rule was enforced during services, weddings, funerals, and any other gatherings. Those who attempted to bypass it were subject to reprimand, fines, or public penance. The law was clear, precise, and unyielding, a direct response to one nobleman's moment of thoughtlessness. Yet the implications of this decision were broader than anyone initially imagined. Daily life, previously ungoverned by such specifics, now became subject to heightened awareness. Parishioners became conscious of every action within the sacred walls. Children learned to remain silent, not only in speech but in action. Even the most minor indulgence, nibbling bread, sipping wine, adjusting clothing, was scrutinized, internalized, and regulated. One individual's lapse had transformed an entire community's relationship with space, decorum, and authority. Sir Ulrich himself remained a figure of mild embarrassment, yet he continued his noble duties. Some contemporaries wrote that he expressed private regret, while others claimed he considered the reaction excessive. Regardless of his personal feelings, the law endured, shaping church behavior for decades. Priests cited it in sermons. Parents reminded children, clergy reminded even visiting nobles that no privilege excused disrespect for sacred space. The memory of the incident became a quiet moral lesson embedded in daily life. As this first section closes, consider the quiet power of a single action in a structured society. One nobleman's simple act of eating during Mass led to codified rules, altered community behavior, and a lasting lesson on decorum. In the medieval world, small disruptions could ripple outward, shaping culture and expectation in ways that remained long after the individual had departed. And so you are left with a question that lingers in the mind. How many other seemingly minor acts, overlooked at the moment, quietly shaped the rules, rituals, and boundaries that governed medieval life, and by extension the society we inherit today? Following the incident with Sir Ulrich de Vienne, the medieval town experienced a subtle but pervasive shift in behavior. What had once been an ordinary congregation, moving freely within the church to kneel, stand, or whisper to neighbours, became more attentive to decorum in ways both obvious and imperceptible. The law forbidding eating within the church, while initially aimed at a single nobleman's lapse, rippled outward, influencing not only the clergy and nobility but common parishioners as well. Priests and church officials took the enforcement of the rule seriously. During services, they would patrol the aisles, keeping a careful eye on the congregation. Minor infractions, such as opening a small package of bread or drinking water discreetly, were met with firm but measured admonishment. Repeat offenders, whether noble or commoner, could be required to perform penance, standing or kneeling in designated spots for a period of time. These punishments were not brutal, yet they reinforced the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable behavior, subtly teaching the congregation to self-regulate. The town's social rhythm adjusted accordingly. Families reminded children before entering the church not to eat, drink, or fidget. Merchants attending Mass delayed their breakfasts until afterward. Even the nobles, accustomed to privileges that often allowed them exceptions, began to accept the constraints. Over time, the rule became so internalized that its enforcement was largely unnecessary. The fear of social censure and personal shame ensured compliance. In essence, the law transformed private discipline into a communal habit. This transformation extended beyond the immediate act of eating. The incident became a touchstone for maintaining order within the sacred space. Congregants began to pay closer attention to posture, behavior, and attentiveness during services. Whispers were measured, gestures subdued, and minor distractions avoided. The church, previously a space that tolerated the natural fidgeting, coughing, or restless movement of ordinary life, became a venue of almost ritualized restraint. In this way, one moment of indulgence, Ulrich's simple meal, had recalibrated the behavioral expectations of an entire community. The psychological effect on the parishioners was subtle but lasting. The law cultivated a sense of vigilance, even in the absence of constant oversight. Members of the congregation learned to monitor themselves and one another. Social norms became internalized, creating a culture of compliance that extended to other areas of life. Discipline within the church influenced conduct in the market, the home, and communal gatherings. People observed one another, reinforced boundaries, and participated in the collective maintenance of order. Despite these changes, there were instances of quiet resistance. Children occasionally hid small snacks in their robes or purses, relishing the thrill of minor defiance. Young men might whisper or hum during long sermons, only to quiet themselves quickly when noticed. And visiting nobles, unfamiliar with local customs, sometimes tested the boundaries of the law, prompting gentle but firm corrections from clergy. These small rebellions were fleeting, yet they remind us that human nature often seeks balance between constraint and personal desire. Historians later noted that this episode exemplifies a broader pattern in medieval societies. Single acts of deviation could catalyze regulations that structured entire communities. While Sir Ulrich's meal was minor, it exposed the tension between individual impulses and collective expectations. Authorities responded not merely to the immediate disruption, but to the potential precedent it could set, creating rules that preserved communal order at the cost of personal spontaneity. The long-term impact extended beyond the town's borders. Neighboring villages took note of the enforcement, and church authorities in other regions referenced the town's ordinances as examples of proper conduct. Over decades, the prohibition against eating in churches became normalized across wider regions, demonstrating how a localized incident could have far-reaching cultural and social consequences. In reflecting on these events, it becomes clear that order in medieval communities was maintained less through abstract principles and more through practical responses to human behavior. Laws and restrictions were shaped by observation, by trial and error, and by the need to prevent minor disruptions from cascading into larger conflicts. One nobleman's lapse revealed the fragility of decorum, and the community's response ensured its stability for generations. As Section 2 closes, you are left to consider the subtle forces that shape daily life, how minor acts, unremarkable at the time, can influence behavior, expectations, and even morality across an entire community. The ripple effect of a single incident, meant perhaps only to satisfy hunger, can quietly shape the culture, rituals, and self-discipline of people for decades. And so, one question remains. In a society so attuned to order, what other small disruptions, eaten bread, whispered words, or overlooked gestures, might have quietly changed the rules and routines of medieval life, leaving their mark long after the original actors were gone? Years passed, and the church stood as it had for centuries. Walls of stone weathered by time, sunlight filtering through colored glass, the scent of incense and candle wax filling the air. The market town, too, maintained its rhythm, shaped in part by one incident that had seemed trivial at the time: Sir Ulrich de Vayenne's ill-timed meal during morning mass. The prohibition against eating in churches had become routine, its origins remembered only in the hushed stories of elders or the footnotes of local chronicles. Yet its influence endured, subtly shaping how the townspeople related to sacred space, authority, and one another. By the time of Ulrich's death, the social norms he had disrupted were firmly entrenched. Parishioners no longer questioned why eating was forbidden. The law had become self-reinforcing. Children were taught reverence through habit, not merely instruction. Even traveling nobles, unfamiliar with the town's specific ordinances, learned to adjust their behavior upon entering the church. The law, once a response to a single act, had become an invisible teacher, guiding conduct across generations. The long-term consequences extended beyond etiquette. The town's commitment to order within sacred spaces reinforced broader social cohesion. Congregants practiced attention and respect, not only in church but also in marketplaces, guild halls, and communal gatherings. The collective mindfulness born of this small regulation enhanced mutual accountability and predictability in daily life. Life became quieter, more deliberate, and less prone to conflict, yet it also became less spontaneous, less playful, and less open to minor human imperfections. A culture of discipline and measured restraint. Ulrich himself, for all his unintended influence, became a quiet symbol of human fallibility. Chronicles noted him not as a villain, but as a cautionary example of how individual behavior can ripple outward with consequences beyond one's imagination. A single act, driven by human desire and momentary convenience, had prompted legislation that affected thousands of lives. Future generations would navigate the balance between personal inclination and communal expectation, in part because of this one man's appetite. Interestingly, the rule did not extinguish all creativity or human expression. People adapted. Children hummed melodies in their heads or whispered them quietly to one another. Visiting performers entertained in other public spaces, careful to avoid the church. Even clergy, while enforcing the rule, allowed small moments of private reflection and song outside the central ritual. The restriction, while rigid, shaped ingenuity as much as it constrained behavior. In this way, human resilience found ways to endure within boundaries, demonstrating a subtle interplay between constraint and creativity. The story of Sir Ulrich and the ban on eating in churches illustrates a recurring pattern in history. Ordinary acts, seemingly insignificant at the time, can shape collective behavior and social norms for generations. Laws and rituals often emerge not from abstract principle, but from practical responses to real events. Human societies codify the consequences of behavior to preserve order, yet, in doing so, they also shape culture, psychology, and morality in ways that ripple far beyond the original incident. As you imagine the quiet church, the attentive parishioners, and the absent meal that sparked decades of discipline, one thought lingers. History is composed not only of battles, treaties, and revolutions, but also of small human lapses, mistakes, and decisions that quietly ripple across time. The daily rhythms, personal impulses, and minor transgressions of ordinary individuals often leave traces as enduring as any monumental event. And so, in the echo of Ulrich's forgotten nibble, a reflection arises: how many of the rules and behaviors that govern our own lives were shaped by someone's small, seemingly inconsequential actions, acts of human desire, folly, or curiosity, long before we were aware of their consequences. The village green was small, enclosed by a loose ring of timbered cottages, their thatched roofs darkened by centuries of smoke and rain. In fair weather, it served as the heart of communal life, a place for markets, for children to play, for neighbors to gather in shared work or conversation, and once it had been the center of celebration, where villagers marked seasonal festivals with music, dancing, and communal feasting. It was during one such festival, in the late spring, that an event occurred which would reverberate through the village for decades. A young peasant named Thomas, known for his exuberance and boundless energy, decided to lead a spontaneous dance. The occasion was simple. The planting season had concluded. The crops had survived the early frosts, and the villagers were for once relieved of the constant labor that defined their lives. Thomas, feeling the rush of joy and freedom that came with communal relief, began to clap, stamp, and leap across the green, motioning for others to join him. Initially, the dance was informal, playful, and seemingly harmless. Children mirrored his movements with giggles, while a few of the young adults joined in with caution, wary of attracting the attention of the village elders. But Tomas's energy was contagious. Within minutes, a growing circle had formed, extending beyond the initial bounds of the green, spilling into the muddy paths that led between homes. The sound of stamping feet, laughter, and singing echoed through the village, drawing more participants and curious onlookers. It was not long before the elders, vested with authority over communal order and moral conduct, took notice. Public dancing, though common in some regions, was often regarded with suspicion by religious and civic leaders. In this village, dancing in public was tolerated only during officially sanctioned festivals, and even then, carefully monitored. Tomas's impromptu celebration, uncontrolled and unsanctioned, was a direct challenge to these norms. The first confrontation occurred when Father Benoit, the parish priest, arrived at the green. His robes flared in the wind, and the heavy wooden staff in his hand seemed to emphasize the seriousness of his intent. He called out to Thomas, instructing him to stop the dancing immediately. "This is not a festival sanctioned by the church. he said, voice rising over the din of feet and laughter. Order must be maintained, and indulgence must not distract from duty and devotion. Thomas, spirited and unafraid, argued that the dance brought joy, celebrated hard work, and fostered community. The crops are safe, the sun shines, and our hearts are light, he said. Why should we not celebrate what we have survived? But the priest's admonitions carried the weight of moral and social authority. The elders gathered, reinforcing the prohibition against unsanctioned public dancing. Those who had joined Thomas reluctantly dispersed, leaving the green quiet once more, save for the whispers of discontent and the occasional stomp of a reluctant foot. The incident was minor in the moment, yet its consequences were enduring. The village council convened within days, drafting rules to prevent similar occurrences. Public dancing outside sanctioned times was prohibited. Violators faced fines or public penance. The penalties were moderate, but the cultural impact was significant. The village green, once a site of spontaneous communal joy, became regulated and predictable. Festivals still occurred, but they followed strict schedules, with dances choreographed and supervised. The exuberance that Thomas had sparked, impromptu, infectious, and entirely human, was contained. Beyond the immediate village, the story spread quietly. Travelers and merchants noted the regulations, and other nearby communities referenced them as examples of maintaining order during communal gatherings. Thomas's dance, meant as a moment of collective joy, inadvertently became a cautionary tale, illustrating how one individual's actions could shape communal behavior for generations. As the villagers adapted to the new rules, they learned both compliance and subtle subversion. Children continued to imitate dances in private, behind barns or in secluded corners. Young adults whispered songs and mimed steps when no elder watched. The human impulse to celebrate persisted, but it became quieter, private, and carefully moderated. As this first section draws to a close, the story leaves us with a reflection. One small, joyful act, a peasant's simple dance, prompted rules that altered communal life in subtle yet lasting ways. The impulse to celebrate freely, though natural and human, collided with structures of authority and regulation, leaving a mark on social behavior for decades. And one question lingers: how often does a single act of human joy, curiosity, or defiance quietly shape the rules, customs, and limitations of society for generations, in ways that may never be recorded in history's grand narratives? In the weeks and months following Thomas's impromptu dance, the village adjusted to a new rhythm, one governed less by spontaneity and more by careful observance of rules. The green, which had once been a space of organic celebration, now existed as a zone of constrained activity. Children played, merchants hawked goods, and laborers passed through on routine errands, but all within boundaries established to prevent another outbreak of unsanctioned merriment. The village council, alongside Father Benoit, took deliberate measures to enforce the regulations. Notices were posted on the church doors and at the edges of the green, declaring the prohibition against public dancing outside approved festivals. The council instituted minor penalties for infractions. The first offence might be a public reprimand, the second a small fine, and repeated violations could lead to temporary exclusion from communal events. The laws were modest in severity but formidable in effect, creating a culture of self-surveillance among the villagers. Behavioral change was immediate. Families arriving for routine gatherings or market days were careful to keep their children within earshot, discouraging spontaneous stomps or clapping. Musicians, who might once have played lively tunes on whim, now requested permission in advance, timing their melodies to coincide with sanctioned activities. Even festival organizers, who previously relied on improvisation to enliven events, began meticulously planning dances and songs, leaving no space for unexpected exuberance. Yet the human impulse to celebrate could not be fully erased. In private corners, barn lofts, secluded pathways, and hidden glades, children and young adults continued to mimic the dances Thomas had started. They whispered songs, clapped hands in rhythm, and shared small moments of joy away from the watchful eyes of elders. These secret acts of resistance were subtle, fleeting, and unrecorded, yet they testified to the resilience of human expression. Even in a world governed by rules, the need for play, music, and celebration endured. Historians later noted that this incident illustrates a broader pattern in medieval life. Authority often responded decisively to disruptions in order, especially when the disruption involved communal spaces or behaviors. One person's spontaneous action here, a peasant's joyful dance, could prompt rules that shaped the behavior of everyone in a community, often for decades. Compliance became habitual, self-regulation became second nature, and small acts of rebellion became private, secretive, or symbolic. The social and psychological effects were nuanced. On the one hand, predictability increased, making gatherings less chaotic and reducing conflicts between neighbors. On the other, vitality and spontaneity, elements central to communal identity, were diminished. The villagers had traded exuberance for stability, and though they continued to celebrate life, it was in measured doses, carefully orchestrated to avoid friction with authority. Thomas himself became a figure of legend, both cautionary and celebrated. Stories about the young peasant who had dared to dance freely were shared quietly, often in whispers around hearths or in private conversation among neighbors. He represented both the power of joyful defiance and the limits imposed by social expectation. Though the law curbed his freedom, it could not erase his example, which persisted in memory, influencing behavior in subtle, almost invisible ways. This period also illustrates the interplay between human nature and societal regulation. Authority structures, whether councils, clergy, or elders, sought to preserve order and prevent disruption, yet their interventions shaped the very behaviors they were attempting to control. The restriction on dancing altered patterns of movement, sound, and interaction within the village, creating a culture where joy was permissible only under supervision, spontaneity was rare, and communal rituals were carefully choreographed. As this section closes, the quiet lesson becomes evident. Human behaviors, especially those tied to celebration, expression, or emotion, are profoundly influenced by social rules, even when those rules emerge from minor, isolated incidents. One peasant's dance, meant as a fleeting act of joy, created ripple effects that shaped cultural norms, social cohesion, and the boundaries of permissible behavior in the village for generations. And so you are left with a thought to consider: how many of the customs, limits, or rules that guide everyday life in communities, then and now, originated from a single act of exuberance, curiosity, or defiance, remembered not for its immediate impact, but for the long shadows it cast across time. Years later, the village green had become a space defined by order, predictability, and quiet compliance. The laughter and spontaneity that Thomas had inspired were largely absent from public life, replaced by carefully scheduled events under the watchful eyes of elders and clergy. Festival dances were now choreographed, rehearsed, and supervised. Every movement was controlled to prevent disruption. The green itself, once a site of unrestrained celebration, had become a symbol of the community's learned restraint. Yet the influence of Thomas's single act endured in memory and habit. His impromptu dance was whispered about in homes, recounted with amusement, mild admiration, or quiet disapproval. Children heard the story of the boy who had challenged order, often with an implicit lesson about boundaries, consequences, and the delicate balance between personal expression and communal stability. The tale became part of the village's cultural fabric, a reminder that individual actions, even joyful ones, could reverberate far beyond their immediate moment. Interestingly, the villagers found ways to preserve small remnants of that exuberance. Children played muted games, improvising dance steps behind barns or in fields hidden from view. Families sang quietly around hearths, and musicians experimented with harmonies in private. Though public performance was constrained, private expression survived, demonstrating the resilience of human creativity, even under strict rules. The contrast between visible control and hidden play became a defining feature of life in the village. Historians studying this period note that the regulation of public dancing illustrates a broader pattern in medieval societies. Authorities responded to disruptions not merely to enforce rules, but to maintain the cohesion and predictability of communal life. One individual's exuberance, seen as harmless, even joyful, was interpreted as a potential threat to social order. The solution, therefore, was regulation, discipline, and long-term behavioral shaping. Over time, compliance became habitual, deviation became private, and human creativity adapted to the constraints imposed by authority. Thomas himself grew up in a village that no longer allowed spontaneous dance, yet his brief moment of joyful rebellion shaped generations. The green, constrained and regulated, reminded villagers that every action carried social consequences. Even as order prevailed, the story of Thomas's dance lived on as a quiet symbol of human vitality and the sometimes hidden cost of social conformity. The enduring lesson is subtle yet profound. Ordinary actions, driven by human impulse, can produce outcomes that far exceed their immediate significance. Thomas's single act of joy reshaped communal norms, instilled new rules, and influenced behavior for decades. In this, we see a recurring truth about human societies. The delicate interplay between freedom and structure, spontaneity and control, creativity and compliance, often hinges on the smallest acts of individuals. As the village green lay silent under the afternoon sun, with shadows stretching across the well-worn paths, one reflection emerges clearly. History is not only composed of grand battles, sweeping laws, or famous leaders, it is also built from these small, seemingly trivial acts. One peasant's dance, one noble's meal, one minstrel's song, that ripple outward, quietly shaping communities and culture for generations. And so, the final thought lingers. How many of the routines, restrictions, and social expectations we accept today began not as deliberate policy, but as the response to a single ordinary act, an act that challenged order, expressed joy, or simply refused to be ignored?